The protagonists in The Winter's Tale and Othello start their plays as two happy, powerful men. Leontes in The Winter's Tale is the king of Sicilia, revelling in entertaining his old childhood friend Polixenes, the king of Bohemia, with his wife. Meanwhile, Othello, in the play bearing his name, has somehow managed to subvert racial expectations by marrying the beautiful white senator's daughter, Desdemona. Yes, there is the embarrassment of his new wife's father's anger, but this is quickly brushed aside by the powers that be, keen to keep Othello on side so that he carries on commanding the Venetian army so successfully. Yet, both men's happiness becomes soured during the course of the plays by the same emotion that all of us have experienced at some point: jealousy. How this jealousy is portrayed and what effect it has within both texts will be the subject of this, my latest video, filmed in the wonderful Livaria Esperanza in the capital of Madeira, Funchal. Stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare. There is no doubt that both Leontes and Othello become similarly deranged and demented when infected with the germs of jealousy. Both share infuriating feelings of frustration about supposedly being cuckolded and how impossible it is to restrain what they perceive as the boundless appetite of female sexuality. In Act 1, Scene 2 of The Winter's Tale, Leontes rants about the huge number of men who have been deceived by their rampaging wives. And 'tis powerful, think it, from east, west, north and south, be it concluded, no barricado for a belly. Know it will let in and out the enemy with bag and baggage. The referencing of all four compass points implies that such powerful female sexual urges are not restricted to one geographical area, whilst the metaphorical reference to a barricado, a barricade, suggests that Leontes feels that there is no way of closing off a woman's vagina, and that it will invariably allow access to balls and penis or bags and baggage. The use of military terminology is apt, as it sums up well Leontes' poorly formed understanding of female sexuality. Vaginas are to be attacked and conquered, and cannot be relied upon by their inconstant female overseers to keep themselves exclusively for a husband's proper use. Describing women purely in terms of a poorly formed male impression of the hunger and conquerability of their vaginas is paranoid, misogynistic fare, and emphasises Leontes' fear and lack of understanding of what makes Hermione tick. Othello unleashes similarly misogynistic tirades which highlight similar desires to control and possess female sexuality. His use of imagery is frequently disturbing. I'd rather be a toad and live upon the vapour of a dungeon than keep a corner in the thing I love for others' uses. The corner in the thing I love is presumably Desdemona's vagina, and Othello vows that he would rather be a reptile and breathe in stinking, rancid air than permit other men to ejaculate into his wife. The idea of wanting your partner to be faithful is a natural, understandable one, but the key point is that both Othello and Leontes objectify their wives in terms of their vaginas and how these can be used by men. Emilia is not quite so crude in Act 3, Scene 4, but her imagery makes a very similar point. Men are all but stomachs, and we all but food. They eat us hungrily, and when they are full, they belch us. This tendency to objectify also makes both men more prone to jealousy in the first place. If you predominantly see your wife in terms of her physical appearance and her possession of a vagina, then it follows that you are likely to undervalue other qualities, such as loyalty, ability to make independent decisions, think, etc., which may convince you of elective faithfulness. Hermione in The Winter's Tale indirectly makes this point during her trial charade, arguing that Leontes as her husband should know her character better than anyone. So jealousy draws out male misogyny, which may lie comparatively dormant during happier times. Jealousy also leads to the men suffering terribly from the idea that they have been humiliated, that they may be being laughed at behind their backs. Leontes in particular writhes from such paranoia. In a telling aside in Act 1, Scene 2, he frets in a frenzy, "They're here with me already, whispering, rounding, Cecilia is a so forth. 'Tis far gone when I shall gust it last." Leontes is already convinced that his subjects are animatedly gossiping about his humiliating status as a man with a wife who has cheated on him. But in his torment, he feels unable to quote them using the actual word cuckold, hence the replacement of so forth. There is no evidence for this unfaithfulness whatsoever in a play, which at this point is only into its second scene. The effect is that the audience and those on stage have no option but to inwardly question his mental state. Camillo, in alarm, tells Leontes to be cured of this diseased opinion. Shakespeare is suggesting that jealousy, in its most extreme forms, can morph from mere emotion into genuine mental illness. Othello, like Leontes, suffers terribly from the pulsating throbs of his jealousy, but he is more obsessed by the violent actions he must commit to punish his wife, rather than impotent speculations about what people may or may not be thinking about him. "I'll tear her all to pieces" is one memorably disturbing ejaculation, following Iago's ludicrous suggestion that Cassio laid his leg over Iago's thigh in his sleep and sighed for Desdemona, as is the vow, "Arise, black vengeance, from thy hollow cell." But of course Othello, as a mere general, and a black one within a racist white society, doesn't have the same options for revenge that Leontes the king in A Winter's Tale has. Whereas Leontes can decide to publicly put Hermione on trial and summon higher judgment from Apollo and overrule the verdict if he chooses to do so, as indeed he does, Othello's position within Christian Venetian society is more ambivalent. Yes, he holds a respected position within society, but this is exclusively due to his prowess as a general and a successful warrior, and is in spite of his black race. Just as, under duress, jealous men can resort to viewing women in terms of their used vaginas, Othello is brusquely used by the Senate each time Venice and its territories come under attack. In Act 1, Scene 3, without any preamble whatsoever, the Duke informs Othello that "we must straight employ you against the general enemy Ottoman," and it is surely his success as a military commander which ensures Brabantio's appalling racist appeal for justice against his marriage with his daughter is so rapidly dismissed. Similarly, in Act 4, Scene 1, Othello receives a letter from the Duke and senators commanding him home, deputing Cassio in his government. Whilst the casual referencing of Cassio's name within a respected context is yet another trigger which confirms poor Desdemona's fate, this letter also makes clear how Othello has to do as he's told. He must be a follower, rather than a bold Leontes-esque summoner of justice. So there doesn't seem to be any question of Othello pursuing public justice following his discovery of Desdemona's sins, unlike in A Winter's Tale. But there are other factors beyond Othello's status as a mere general and not a king. As a black man, he lives within an astonishingly racist for modern standards society. Othello's position and sense of himself as a black outsider is likely to affect his decision-making, both consciously and subconsciously. In Act 1, Scene 2, Brabantio, a highly respectable senator, enraged by his daughter's marriage to Othello, publicly denounces him thus: "How could my daughter have run from her guardage to the sooty bosom of such a thing as thou?" Brabantio's language explicitly dehumanises Othello. He is not a valiant, loyal warrior fighting for Venice, but a mere thing, and this word in Elizabethan times could also mean penis. Perhaps a modern, cruder equivalent might be Brabantio hinting that Othello is a dickhead. He is not a pure Venetian, but one tainted by a sooty bosom. Such racist views permeate the play as a whole, from Iago's ground-level taunts to Brabantio about an old black ram tupping your white ewe, to Roderigo's genuine astonishment at Desdemona being able to love Othello. Othello cannot escape the knowledge of his difference and perceived racial inferiority. Combined with a career which has been successful due to sanctioned use of violence, is it any wonder that Othello ultimately sees himself as a single-man operative, albeit ably aided by Iago, who must go it alone to secure revenge by terrifyingly violent means? So Leontes and Othello follow different routes to achieve justice following their mistaken beliefs in their wife's filthy slutting, and I have explored how the reasons for these differences stem from their different statuses as omnipotent king, Leontes, and black outsider general within a racist society, Othello. But let's rewind a little. How do the men become so jealous in the first place? Well, in The Winter's Tale, the supposed cuckold is entirely alone in coming up with the idea of his wife's infidelity. In Othello, the idea is deliberately planted there by a single individual who improvises, an extraordinarily elaborate and ingenious scheme to put them all at least into a jealousy so strong that judgment cannot cure. So Leontes in The Winter's Tale independently becomes ravaged by jealousy. So ravaged that balanced observers speculate that he has been tricked by an Iago-esque figure. Does this come out of nowhere? Well, yes and no. The first murmurings of jealousy surely stem from Hermione's successful campaign to persuade Polixenes, the king of Bohemia, to stay a week longer following his 9-month visit. Polixenes refuses Leontes' repeated pleas for him to extend his sojourn, but reassures him by saying, "There is no tongue that moves, none in the world, so soon as yours could win me." Having soothed Leontes' pride with this emphatic declaration that if anyone were to persuade him to stay, it would be him, Polixenes then goes on to be swayed by Hermione. Whilst publicly ceremoniously celebrating, inwardly Leontes experienced the first flushes of suspicion as he petulantly reminds the audience, at my request he would not. His wife's suspiciously successful quest contributes to Leontes' thinking about Hermione and Polixenes' relationship in a totally different light. He looks more closely at the pair's body language, and for the first time in 9 months, he doesn't like what he sees. Hermione gives her hand to Polixenes, and Leontes starts, too hot, to mingle friendship far as mingling bloods, but to be paddling palms and pinching fingers, as now they are, and making practised smiles as in a looking-glass, and then to sigh as 'twere the mort of the deer. Oh, that is entertainment my bosom likes not, nor my brows. In Othello, the otherwise moronic Roderigo correctly describes similar body language. Didst thou not see her paddle with the palm of his hand between Cassio and Desdemona as but courtesy? And onlookers on stage and off in The Winter's Tale are likely to interpret such gestures between Hermione and Polixenes as the natural affection and polite familiarity between an old friend comfortable in the company of his old friend's wife. Of course, Leontes also refers to smiles and sighs, but these can also crop up innocuously in any type of conversation between all kinds of people. Perhaps the extent to which Leontes is totally irrational in his suspicions, as opposed to there being some small justification for concern, depends on directorial interpretation. Have a look at Hermione and Polixenes' body language and facial expressions during the same Leontes speech in Robin Lau's celebrated 1998 RSC production.
But to be paddling palms and pinching fingers, as now they are, and making practice smiles as to a looking glass, and then to sigh as 'twere the mortar o' the deer. Oh, that is entertainment my bosom likes not, nor my brows.
In this section of the film, Leontes' suspicions seem all the more absurd. Hermione is not only visibly heavily pregnant, but also looks exhausted. She certainly emits a sigh, but it clearly originates from the cumbersome pain of the latter stages of pregnancy. A sigh of sexual satisfaction, as implied in Leontes' imagery, as 'twere the mort of the deer, it is not. Polixenes is clearly being solicitous about the Queen's health and ensuring that she rests when necessary. The audience watching this production will immediately assume that Leontes is off his rocker. In Christopher Wheeldon's 2014 Royal Ballet 3-act version of The Winter's Tale, it would appear that Leontes has considerably more grounds for his jealousy and suspicion of Polixenes. Note Leontes' twisted, contorted body movements, reflecting his inner angst, as he spies upon Polixenes and Hermione amongst classical statues depicting sensuous lovemaking. Polixenes rubs his hands sensuously down the sides of pregnant Hermione's body and strokes her baby bump, causing the majority of the audience to assume that he is surely the father of the unborn baby-to-be. But in Shakespeare's original text, there appears to be no rational or logical basis for Leontes' jealousy. He may be peeved that Hermione and not himself managed to persuade Polixenes to stay for longer, but on closer inspection, Hermione simply tried harder. The pair's lines at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 2 show that Leontes' attempts to cajole were formal and abrupt, whereas Hermione used potent, forceful imagery. Irrespective of speaker, is it any wonder that vows such as "force me to keep you as a prisoner, not like a guest, so you shall pay your fees when you depart and save your thanks," have more of an effect than comparatively indifferent to the arts of persuasion lines such as "stay your thanks a while and pay them when you part." Whereas Leontes' jealousy is triggered rapidly following an independent re-evaluation of the dynamics between his wife and an old playmate, Othello's doubts grow more slowly following a multifaceted campaign against him by a bitter employee. Iago helps to engineer a situation in which Cassio, disgraced following drunken debauchery and subsequent demotion, needs to speak to Othello's wife alone in order to persuade her to use her influence with Othello to get his old position back. With this situation in place, Iago is then able to stage manage Cassio's visits to Desdemona and prompts Othello into willful misinterpretation. This is first seen in Act 3, Scene 3. Cassio exits, having pleaded with Desdemona to do everything she can to help him be reinstated as Othello's lieutenant. Iago, commenting on Cassio's exit, resorts to one of his favourite tactics in the play, unleashing initially unexplained exclamations intended to unsettle. "Ha! I like not that," he snorts. Othello, not unreasonably or unsurprisingly, asks what Iago is saying, to which the latter responds enigmatically, "Nothing, my lords," or if I know not what. This mysterious interjection starts the unsettling process, which is continued with Iago's retrospective questioning about Cassio's role in Othello's wooing of Desdemona and his hyperbolic responses to Othello's answers, in which keywords are remorselessly repeated. Let's look at an example of this. Still in Act 3, Scene 3, Othello asks, fairly innocently, whether Cassio is not honest. Iago, to use Othello's later verb, simply echoes and cries, "Honest, my lord?" A few moments later, Othello asks Iago, "What dost thou think?" "Think, my lord," is the similarly structured response, and the effect is to madden Othello and convince him that his supposedly loyal servant has some monster in his thought too hideous to be shown. Iago continues upon this path of inching his way to implanting doubts in Othello's mind about the faithfulness of Desdemona and the rectitude of her dealings with Cassio, which is ultimately successful. I have deliberately analysed a small section of this scene in some detail to illustrate just how patiently manipulative and determined Iago is to torment Othello with jealousy. When you compare the two texts side by side, and consider how Leontes was driven into a jealous frenzy merely by witnessing a few effeminate hand gestures, or solicitous in the RSC production, between his wife and best friend, what chance does poor Othello have of resisting, faced with such a malign, unwavering force as Iago? Othello and Leontes share similar paralysing, painful emotions following the onslaught of jealous feelings, which reveal underlying misogyny. Whereas Othello is manipulated by Iago into experiencing jealousy, Leontes becomes jealous of his own accord. Their differing backgrounds and positions within society influence their reactions to their newfound knowledge, with the king choosing to publicly indict, and the outsider, black general, being fed dubious proof before accusing privately and killing. What about the consequences of the pair's jealousy? How do these compare across the two texts? Well, in A Winter's Tale, the tragic consequences of Leontes' jealousy occur much earlier in the play than in Othello, but in both texts those affected spreads far beyond the perceived love triangle. In Act 1, Scene 2 of A Winter's Tale, Leontes instructs Camillo, a good egg, loyal forever figure, to poison naughty cheater Polixenes. Camillo knows this is morally wrong and decides reluctantly to reveal the plot to Polixenes. This act, of course, means that he would no longer be safe in Sicilia, and so he has to rebuild his life in Bohemia, trusting that Polixenes will prove to be a kind, supportive master. But as well as having to rebuild, Camillo has to distance himself from someone he has grown to love over a long period. Leontes himself spoke previously of their bonds, and the fact that he has trusted him with all the nearest things to my heart, as well my chamber counsels wherein, priest-like, thou hast cleansed my bosom. Camillo's reciprocal valuing of his relationship with Leontes, in which he is obviously content to periodically take on the role of a modern-day therapist, is confirmed in Act 4, Scene 2, when he begs Polixenes leave to return to Sicilia, and Leontes, to whose feelings, sorrows I might be some allay, or I owe ween to think so. At a stroke of crazed jealousy, this mutually rewarding relationship is terminated. Antigonus is an even more unfortunate victim of Leontes' jealousy and subsequent actions. The accused queen has given birth prematurely in jail, and Antigonus' wife, Paulina, presents the baby to Leontes in a bid to attain an emotive response. Leontes is predictably enraged, and after recanting on a previous vow that the baby should be instantly consumed with fire, orders Antigonus to bear it to some remote and desert place quite out of our dominions, and that there thou leave it, without more mercy, to its own protection and favour of the climate. This request paints Leontes as utterly barbarous and inhumane, and it is difficult to ascertain the extent to which this behaviour should be attributed to the temporary madness of his jealousy, or the natural despotism of a king who has never been challenged on anything, something Paulina is brave enough to reference as unhelpful to Leontes when she forces her way in to see him. "'Tis such as you that creep like shadows by him, and do sigh at each his needless heavings, such as you nourish the cause of his awaking." Either way, Leontes' command causes Antigonus's death, far away in the land of Bohemia, ruled by Polixenes, of course. Antigonus is ravaged by a bear after reluctantly placing the baby on the ground as a storm begins. But what is interesting about Antigonus's death, and what makes it stand out from all the deaths that occur in Othello, is that it is described in unmistakably comic terms. The clown jauntily refers simultaneously to the destruction of Antigonus and the boat that brought him hither in the storm. And the effect is to remove nearly all sense of pathos from both events. He cries out, "But to make an end of the ship, to see how the sea flapdragoned it. But first, how the poor souls roared, and the sea mocked them, and how the poor gentleman roared, and the bear mocked him, both roaring louder than the sea or weather." The clown's imagery is ludicrous, referencing the party game of Snapdragon, in which players had to pick up raisins or plums, known as flapdragons, in their mouths from a bowl of burning brandy. By using the verb flapdragon, the clown is suggesting not just the impotence of the sailors faced with a huge powerful force bearing down upon them, i.e. the sea, but also that the sea has been having fun toying with the struggling men before ultimately drowning them. Meanwhile, the subsequent sentence sounds like a round, in which each player takes turn at either roaring the humans or being mocked by the sea or the bear. The cumulative effect of the cyclical repetition is that the audience cannot help but be amused by the clown's quirky descriptions of death, rather than concern themselves unduly with the loss of life, which is a hallmark of both Othello and tragedy in general, but not this more problematic play. So, in A Winter's Tale, there are widespread innocent casualties due to the jealous actions of a powerful man. But in the above examples, one is non-permanently displaced, i.e. Camillo doesn't die and is eventually reunited with his dear master, and the other's death is portrayed in a comic light. In Othello, things work differently. As in A Winter's Tale, there are widespread innocent casualties, but these are caused by the ruthless actions of a man aiming to inspire jealousy rather than the jealous man himself. The first victim of Iago's decision to put the Moor at least into a jealousy so strong that judgment cannot cure is the governor of Cyprus, Montano. He is seriously injured after intervening in a sword fight between Rodrigo and Cassio during the Othello ordained celebrations, so much so that he fears for his life. "Zounds, I bleed still, I am hurt to the death. Worthy Othello, I am hurt to danger." But this fight has been engineered by Iago, first deliberately getting Cassio drunk, knowing his hot temper and dangerously low alcohol tolerance levels, and then by instructing Rodrigo to provoke Cassio that he may strike at you. As previously mentioned, this fight results in Cassio's demotion, which allows Iago to build up a situation in which Othello would become jealous of his wife's intimate tete-a-tetes with Cassio, and especially the fact that she will use every opportunity when they are together to plead his case. So whereas A Winter's Tale is characterised by losses and deaths that are caused directly by the man who thinks he has been cuckolded and whose jealousy is confirmed, in Othello, injuries and deaths of those outside the Othello, Desdemona, Cassio triumvirate highlight Iago's ruthlessness, a man hell-bent on cementing Othello's jealousy, knowing that the consequences to both his general and Desdemona are likely to be catastrophic. Montano is an early, non-fatal victim. The pawn to Iago's chessboard and perhaps real-life queen, Rodrigo, is eventually ignominiously killed. How? In Act 5, Scene 1, Rodrigo, inexplicably persuaded by Iago to attack Cassio once again, duly lunges with partial success, but is himself wounded in the process. During the chaos of the nighttime aftermath, Iago, entering in his usual guise as a grievously honest man who loves law and order, stabs Rodrigo to death, resulting in the latter's dying, wretchedly late recognition that his perceived ally is actually an inhuman dog. Iago's initial hope had been for Cassio to be killed, which would thus put Desdemona in a similar position to Hermione in A Winter's Tale, who is unable to call on Polixenes as an ally to attest her innocence due to his life-saving gallop back home across the seas. With Cassio killed, the number of voices who know definitively of Desdemona's innocence is halved, thus making it more likely for Othello's jealousy and mistaken beliefs to continue, with Iago licking his lips at the likely consequences. Cassio doesn't die, but Iago casually kills Rodrigo instead, so that the latter doesn't find out about and seek revenge for his casual fleecing of gold and jewels. In many ways, the losses and deaths in Othello disturb more than those in A Winter's Tale. Not only do they happen on stage, in A Winter's Tale, Antigonus famously exits the stage pursued by a bear before being eaten alive off stage, without any comedy to lighten the effect, but they seem to be primarily caused by evil as opposed to the twisted logic of jealousy. So in both texts, either the malign forces of jealousy or malign forces seeking to create jealousy damage and destroy the lives of people who are firmly outside the traditional adult love triangle. I have referred to Antigonus's death as well as the sailors, and Camillo's banishment by proxy in A Winter's Tale, and Montano's wounding and Roderigo's death in Othello, but I could also have mentioned Mamillius's death and Hermione's baby, brought up away from her family as a shepherd girl in the former text, and Emilia's death and Bianca's public shaming in the latter. What about the effect of the jealousy upon the accused women? What fate befalls them? And how do we as audiences respond? Hermione from A Winter's Tale has the advantage over Desdemona in Othello that she finds out about her husband's jealousy and why he is jealous much earlier in the play. Leontes storms into his wife's quarters in Act 2, Scene 1, bringing his usual train of lords with him, and publicly accuses her of thus, "Away with Mamillius, and let her sport herself with that she's big with," to Hermione, "for 'tis Polixenes that has made thee swell thus." The scornful word sport, repeated from Hermione's puzzled reactions to Leontes' moody declarations that she has too much blood in Mamillius, is a suggestion that Hermione should play or have sex with the person who has made her big or pregnant, which he claims in the next clause is Polixenes. Leontes' decision to go public with his accusation results in Hermione's humiliation. Her indignation shines through when, maintaining her dignity, she rebukes her husband thus: "How will this grieve you when you shall come to clearer knowledge that you thus have published me," with the verb publish meaning denounced in public. Later speeches from Hermione reveal just how much she cherishes her reputation, hence highlighting the cruelty of Leontes responding to his jealousy via this route. During her quasi-trial in Act 3, Scene 2, she cries, "But yet hear this, mistake me not. No life, I prize it not a straw, but for mine honour which I would free." In other words, Hermione prioritises her honour and reputation above her very existence, which means nothing in comparison. and her repeated imperatives, "Hear this," and "Mistake me not," emphasise the conviction with which she speaks. I previously quoted Hermione's words affirming Leontes' knowledge of her past life. If Hermione is correct in saying that Leontes should know better than anyone that she has never done anything remotely worthy of blame, then it is only a small step on to suggest that he should also have a genuine insight into her character. Seen in this light, Leontes' decision to publicly condemn, especially without a prior personal conference, comes across as incredibly vindictive, knowing that she is the kind of person who values her reputation so dearly. My own view is that Hermione is being hopelessly naive and optimistic in proposing that Leontes should know what she is like. To me, he seems far too self-obsessed to have ever bothered to delve into discovering anything meaningful about his wife's character beyond her pleasing personal appearance and her possession of a vagina. Hence his later need to suffer and be remorselessly educated by Paulina. Hermione may be devastated by the loss of her honour, but the majority of onlookers would feel her situation preferable to that experienced by Desdemona in the closing tragic stages of Othello. Unlike Leontes, Othello struggles enormously when it comes to revealing his suspicions, either in public or in private in full. Instead, he hints darkly, looks and sounds troubled, and spins his wife an extraordinary story about a handkerchief she has mislaid. Whereas in A Winter's Tale, Leontes tries to claim that affectionate physical gestures, wishy-washy claims about time, and suspicious movements are most certainly not nothing, and are sufficient evidence of guilt. Iago senses that Othello needs, or his campaign would benefit from, something superficially more concrete. He reveals, "I will in Cassio's lodging lose this napkin, and let him find it. Trifles light as air are to the jealous confirmation strong as proofs of holy writ." These words reveal Iago's views about jealous people in general. They are irrational. They seize upon the smallest, insignificant things and treat them as if they are as trustworthy and true as the most respected book of all, especially during Shakespeare's time, the Bible. Othello, sure enough, seizes upon Desdemona's failure to produce a handkerchief of all things. Not a necklace, not a favourite nightdress, not a gifted pair of lacy underwear, as damning evidence of her guilt. And so rather than confront her with his jealous suspicions, he questions her repeatedly about what in his eyes is crucial justification for such suspicions, but in her eyes can only baffle. Othello's repeatedly embroidered, sorry, pun intended, story about the handkerchief becomes wilder and wilder. After initially suggesting that the handkerchief was given to his mother by a mind-reading Egyptian witch, who claimed that it was lost, "My father's eye should hold her loathed," he goes on to say this: "There's magic in the web of it. A Sibyl that had numbered in the world the sun to course 200 compasses, in her prophetic fury sowed the work. The worms were hallowed that did breed the silk, and it was dyed in mummy, which the skilful conserved of maidens' hearts." Let's get that straight. A 200-year-old prophetess furiously sewed the handkerchief. The silk was made using sacred worms and was dyed using mummified maidens' hearts. It is an utterly preposterous tale, clearly untrue, which both reinforces racist stereotypes about the inclination of black people to believe in witchcraft and the dark arts, as propounded by Brabantio, and in its outlandishness suggests that Othello's jealousy is making him dangerously out of control. Whereas before the play begins, Othello's inclination towards jaw-dropping tales made him a fascinating, attractive suitor, as during his courtship of Desdemona. This skill now works against him, coming at the expense of open, clear, focused communication. So Othello's failure to clearly tell Desdemona that he has reason to believe she is sleeping with Cassio directly results in his jealousy increasing. Desdemona, desperate to shift the subject away from the handkerchief, instead chooses the one topic which will only enrage her husband further, the potential reinstatement of Cassio. Without knowing why her husband is ranting in this way, she keeps returning to loyally plead for Cassio. "Pray you let Cassio be received again. You'll never meet a more sufficient man. And, I pray, talk me of Cassio." Of course, if Desdemona had known of his suspicions, she would never have dreamt of choosing this particular moment to ask for his reinstatement. The furious interrogation about the missing handkerchief in Act 3, Scene 4 of Othello reveals a number of things about the nature of jealousy. It can make you irrational and can hamper clear communication, which can potentially result in further misunderstandings which only intensify jealous feelings held. In Othello's case, his jealousy warps his skill for extravagant storytelling, transforming it from something that brings joyous fantasy to the listener to something that brings fear and foreboding. When Othello does finally tell Desdemona of his suspicions, it is too late for her to do anything about it. She is rapidly smothered to death in her bed, and even the idea of this method of killing was planted by Iago into Othello's head, a horrible role reversal of master and servant. So in Othello, jealousy results in the death of a dearly loved wife at the hands of her husband. In A Winter's Tale, it doesn't. Leontes does not kill Hermione with his own hands, but is instead left to believe for 16 years that she has died of excessive grief and suffering as a direct consequence of his jealous actions, which included, let's go for it, jailing and publicly humiliating her, ignoring Apollo's verdict, the death of Mamillius due to the trauma, and discarding their newborn baby and packing it off to barbarous foreign shores. So in A Winter's Tale, jealousy doesn't cause the death of a woman, although I have already talked about the unfortunate collateral damage of Antigonus and, to a lesser extent, Camillo and Perdita. In fact, Leontes' jealousy has a positive outcome, in that his subsequent suffering makes him a wiser, less selfish individual, who, we must hope, is likely to be a far more considerate and sensitive husband to Hermione when their relationship is renewed after a staggering 16 years. The catalyst to the transformation of Leontes from despotic, jealous tyrant to wiser, kinder king and husband is Paulina. Not only does she elect to keep Hermione hidden for 16 years until she deems the moment is right for her return, but she remorselessly uses every opportunity to increase Leontes' understanding of both of himself and the consequences of his jealousy. In some ways, she is a benign version of Iago. Whereas Iago aims to use every opportunity and every word with a view to cementing Othello's jealousy, Paulina never fails to hammer home references to the past, irrespective of how they may fit logically into the context. A good example of this is in Act 5, Scene 1. A gentleman has just entered to announce the arrival of Prince Florizel and his princess in Sicilia. Leontes has never met Florizel, Polixenes' son, and this relationship would surely herald feelings of excitement about future relationships and continuing the bridge building with Polixenes. Instead, Paulina somehow manages to reference this arrival in terms of the haunting past. Had our prince, jewel of children, seen this hour, he had paired well with this lord. There was not a full month between their births. In other words, Mamillius would have got on famously with Florizel. Speculatively, this may well have been true, although there is no way of ascertaining either way. But what Paulina is doing is continuing her re-education of Leontes, so that there is no chance of him returning to the jealous, irrational despotism of the past. The metaphor jewel of children, although conventionally fawning as would be usual when addressing the son of a king, acts as an emotive dagger to Leontes, reminding him of a death which he himself, with hindsight, needlessly caused. That Paulina's campaign to re-educate and remould Leontes is succeeding is indicated by his response to her speculations about Florizel and Mamilius's potential camaraderie. He tells her, "Thou knowest he dies to me again when talked of. Sure, when I shall see this gentleman, thy speeches will bring me to consider that which may unfurnish me of reason." Whereas the Leontes of the first half of the play was characterised by his utter inability to listen, this Leontes is prepared to listen and reflect, so much so that even 16 years after his mad jealousy, thoughts about the past could still drive him mad. Whilst I'm not saying this is necessarily a healthy thing, I do believe that this mental angst is needed in order to allow the possibility of a renewed, equal, contented relationship with Hermione, to whom he has caused so much suffering. The final scene of The Winter's Tale sees Leontes, Perdita and others gathering around Paulina's extraordinarily lifelike statue of Hermione, which comes to life and takes Leontes by the hand, as instructed by Paulina, who, in another similarity with Iago, is able to control events to a considerable degree in the final act of the play. Jealousy has been banished to the bowels of history, as summed up when Leontes, perhaps spotting some awkwardness from Hermione in terms of how to greet Polixenes, urges her thus, "What? Look upon my brother. Both your pardons that ere I put between your holy looks my ill suspicion." In Lau's RSC production, Antony shares Leontes, emotionally joins both the pair's hands together.
Well, look upon my brother. Both your pardon that ere I put between your holy looks my ill suspicion.
As reflected in the mystical flute melody within this production, genuine harmony and love has replaced the tyrannies of jealousy, although getting to this point has involved unnecessary deaths, terrible suffering, and so many wasted years. However, at least there does appear to be hope for Hermione and Leontes, especially with the binding joy of Perdita's return. There is no hope at the end of Othello. Jealousy has consumed so much, rather like the recent fires here in Funchal, leaving only ashes and weaker replacements to take Venice and Cyprus forward. So, how to sum up the portrayal and effects of jealousy in The Winter's Tale and Othello? Well, in both texts, jealousy brings out the nasty, misogynistic sides of the men involved, who seem obsessed by the desire to control rather than really understand their wives. The different statuses and contexts of Leontes and Othello influence the choices they make when fueled by jealousy, with the former using, then abusing, his powers as a king to publicly prosecute, and the latter in an ambivalent position as a highly respected black man within a racist society, coerced into a highly pressurized private confrontation with a deadly outcome. In A Winter's Tale, the jealousy stems from Leontes' mad interpretation of a situation, whereas in Othello, the fiendishly clever and opportunistic Iago creates a cauldron of jealousy within his black master's mind. In both texts, there are widespread innocent victims, people killed, injured and displaced. In Othello, these are caused by the man hell-bent on cementing the jealousy of one man. In A Winter's Tale, these are caused solely by the jealous tyrant. Finally, the ending to A Winter's Tale shows that there can be redemption for those who have wreaked havoc due to jealousy. No such redemption exists in Othello. This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, exploring the portrayal and effect of jealousy within Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale and Othello. I stand outside the Livaria Esperanza within Funchal, which translates as the bookshop of hope. A fitting image as beautiful Funchal within beautiful Madeira continues to get back to normal following the recent fires. Many thanks for watching.